Let's talk about a 300-year stretch, from 1450 to 1750, where a mad dash for riches didn't just create a few empires. No, it completely rewired the entire planet. It really laid the foundation for the world that you and I are living in right now. And it all kicked off with one single powerful idea. So that brings us to our big question for this whole explainer. How did one economic theory become this engine that completely reshaped continents, connected oceans, and really changed the whole course of human history?
All right, first up, the race for wealth. To get what's going on, we have to understand the core economic idea that basically lit the fuse for everything that came next. And that idea was called mercantilism. The goal? Well, it was simple and honestly brutally direct. Get rich. But we're not talking about just any kind of rich. The thinking was, for a nation to be truly powerful, it needed cold, hard cash. We're talking gold and silver. The more of that stuff you had piled up in your treasury, the more powerful you were. Period.
And this idea of a pie, it perfectly captures the mercantilist mindset. They truly believed that the world's wealth was a fixed amount. It wasn't about growing the economy for everybody. No way. This was a zero-sum game. If my nation gets a bigger slice of the pie, that means your nation gets a smaller one. It was all about competition.
So, how'd you win this game? Well, there was a playbook, and it was pretty straightforward. Step 1, make sure you sell way more stuff than you buy. That way cash is always flowing in. Step 2, hoard that cash, that gold and silver, because that's how you measure your power. But step 3 was the secret sauce, the real engine of the whole system. Use colonies. They were a guaranteed source of cheap raw materials and a captive audience you could force to buy all your expensive finished goods. It was this perfect closed loop designed for one thing: maximum profit.
But look, this kind of aggressive global strategy, it was way too big and way too risky for governments to do all by themselves. It needed a totally new kind of vehicle to make it work on a global scale. And this led to a really revolutionary question. What if companies, not just kings and queens, could build empires?
So the early players like Spain and Portugal, they did things the old-fashioned way. The king and queen paid for everything directly from the royal treasury. But then the Dutch and the English came along with a much more powerful model, the joint stock company. This was a whole new kind of partnership, one that blended massive pools of private money with the official backing of the state.
Now, the absolute game-changing innovation that unlocked all this private money was a little concept called limited liability. Just think about it for a second. Before this, if you invested in a voyage and it failed, you could lose everything: your house, your land, the whole shebang. But with limited liability, your personal stuff was safe. The most you could lose was the actual money you put in. All of a sudden, the risk was manageable, and thousands of regular people were willing to pool their cash for a shot at unbelievable riches.
So you end up with this really powerful feedback loop. The government would grant a company a monopoly, basically the exclusive right to trade in a certain part of the world. Then private investors would pour their money in to fund the super risky voyages. These companies, like the famous Dutch East India Company, the VOC, they were basically acting as extensions of their government, projecting power across the globe without the state having to pay for it all.
And the result of this new economic engine, this new corporate vehicle, a world that was more connected than it had ever been before. But what did that connection actually look like on the ground?
Now look, trade in Asia and across the Silk Roads, that had been going on for centuries. That didn't stop. But the real revolution, the thing that changed everything, was the creation of something brand new: the Atlantic system. For the first time in human history, the Americas, Europe, and Africa were locked together in this massive, continuous web of trade and exchange.
And the one thing that powered this new Atlantic engine more than anything else was sugar. Demand for it in Europe was just exploding, and these huge plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil were set up to meet that demand, becoming insanely profitable in the process.
But, okay, if sugar was the engine, then silver was the oil that kept all the gears of the global economy turning, specifically the silver that was pouring out of Spanish mines in the Americas.
And this flow is just mind-boggling when you think about it. Silver, brutally mined by forced labor in places like Potosi, gets shipped to Europe to fund their armies and build their palaces. But here's the thing: Europe didn't really have much that Asia wanted to buy. So a huge chunk of that very same American silver kept on going, flowing east to pay for the silks, spices, and porcelain that Europeans were crazy about. For the first time ever, you have metal from the Americas paying for goods from Asia in the hands of the Europeans. This is the birth of a truly global economy.
But this entire glittering system of profit and global connection, it was built on a foundation of just unimaginable brutality. We have to be honest and confront the horrific human cost that fueled the whole thing.
At first, colonizers tried to force the local indigenous populations to work, but a combination of European diseases and fierce resistance made that system collapse. Then they tried using indentured servants from Europe, but they could never get enough people to satisfy the absolutely bottomless demand of the sugar plantations. And so, the system turned to its final, most horrific solution, the transatlantic slave trade, which forced millions upon millions of Africans into the brutal system of chattel slavery.
So let's be absolutely clear about this. The entire economic structure, the silver flowing to China, the sugar on your table in Europe, the profits filling the pockets of investors in those companies, all of it was made possible by the violent exploitation of enslaved people. You simply cannot separate one from the other.
So, finally, let's talk about the lasting legacy. Because this era didn't just remake economies, it remade entire societies and cultures in ways that we can still feel right now today.
In West Africa, the slave trade just ripped the fabric of society apart. When you lose millions of people, mostly young men, it creates these devastating holes in the population and leads to severe gender imbalances. Whole communities were forced into these painful changes, altering family structures and social norms for generations.
And yet, even in the middle of this unimaginable oppression, you see these incredible acts of cultural resilience. Enslaved people from different parts of Africa were often deliberately mixed together to stop them from being able to communicate. But they overcame that. How? By creating entirely new languages. These Creole languages, which blended words from Europe with grammar from Africa, became this powerful tool for building community, for holding on to their identity, and for resisting their own dehumanization.
You see a similar kind of blending with religion. This process is called syncretism, and it was another powerful act of cultural survival. Indigenous and African peoples would often outwardly adopt Christian practices, but secretly and very creatively, they would merge those practices with their own traditional beliefs. So it wasn't a replacement, it was a fusion, and it created these vibrant, unique spiritual traditions that are still alive and well all across the Americas today.
And that leaves us with one last really important question. This period isn't just something that happened a long time ago. It fundamentally forged the world we all live in. So as you go about your day, I want you to look around and ask yourself, how do the echoes of this era, its economic inequalities, its social structures, its amazing cultural blends, how do they still shape the world that I experience right now?